Hi, it's Miss Sinclair. I wanted to go over the question that I gave you for practice on Monday. So it was y equals sine 4x. So let's talk about some things. The amplitude is the number in front of the sine, that's 1. The amplitude goes with the range, so that's -1 to 1. The frequency is 4. That's the number in front of the x. That means that I expect to see 4 complete cycles of sine from 0 to 2 pi. Now, it just so happens that I asked you to graph from 0 to 2 pi. You're not always asked to graph from 0 to 2 pi. It's a little bit of a coincidence. I asked you to graph from 0 to 2 pi. That means I should see 4 complete cycles of sine on this graph. So let's talk about what a cycle of sine looks like. So I'm going to draw in my midline, just as like a little sketch down here. A complete cycle of sine has 5 main points. We start at the midline, we go up to the highest, which in this case will be 1, back to the midline, then down to the lowest, in this case -1, then back up to the midline. Those 5 main points is one cycle of sine. Okay. Let's keep going. Let's look at what another cycle would look like. So we would do the same, midline, highest, midline, lowest, midline. That's 2 cycles of sine. Midline, highest, midline, lowest, midline. That's 3 cycles of sine. And let's do that 4th cycle. Midline, highest, midline, lowest, midline. So because the frequency is 4, I'm going to see 4 cycles of sine from 0 to 2 pi. This is where 2 pi would be. So let's figure out what the period is. So the formula for period is 2 pi over the frequency. So 2 pi over 4 is pi over 2. So that means at the end of each cycle, pi over 2. So if it takes from 0 to pi over 2 to do this red cycle, it's going to take from pi over 2 to pi to do the blue, then from pi to 3 pi over 2 to do the green, then from 3 pi over 2 to 2 pi to do the purple. Okay, we like to find these critical values or these critical intervals because I want you to think about if we're looking at one cycle of sine, I can really break it up into 4 sections. I'm highlighting them all different colors just so you can see it. So there's the 4 sections that I'm breaking up each sine curve, and cosine gets broken up into 4 sections too. That's why the formula for the critical interval is period over 4. I want to break it up into those 4 sections so I know where to put each of my main dots. The first one goes at 0, and then I have 4 more main dots. That's why we're doing period divided by 4. Okay, so the period is pi over 2 divided by 4. That's going to give me pi over 8. Okay, that means I have a critical value at each pi over 8. So let's think about what that would look like. I have one at 0. Then I have one at pi over 8. Pi over 8 is like 1 pi over 8. Then I have another one at 2 pi over 8. Then I have another one at 3 pi over 8. Then I have another one at 4 pi over 8. Just erasing this so I have more room. Then I have another one at 5 pi over 8, 6 pi over 8, 7 pi over 8, 8 pi over 8. That's only pi, right? 8 pi over 8 is pi. I need to go to 2 pi, so I got to keep going. 9 pi over 8, 10 pi over 8, 11 pi over 8, 12 pi over 8. Got to keep going. 13 pi over 8, 14 pi over 8, 15 pi over 8, 16 pi over 8, and I'm finally going to stop there. It's a long one, because 16 pi over 8 is the same as 2 pi. Okay, it's going to be a little difficult to get this all on the graph, but I'm going to try. Okay. let's make our axes. Okay. So I only need to go up to 1. So I could just do 1, 0, -1. Okay. I have 16, I think. All right, I don't think I'm going to skip any boxes. So let's start labeling. I'll do it again as I label so you can kind of see. So I'm going to label 1 pi over 8. Then I'm going to label 2 pi over 8. I can either leave it as 2 pi over 8 or 2 pi over 8 is pi over 4. 3 pi over 8. 4 pi over 8. 4 pi over 8 is pi over 2. 5 pi over 8. 6 pi over 8. 6 pi over 8 is 3 pi over 4. 7 pi over 8. And then 8 pi over 8. 8 pi over 8 is just pi. Okay. 9 pi over 8. 10 pi over 8. Well, that's 5 pi over 4. 11 pi over 8. 12 pi over 8. 12 pi over 8 is 3 pi over 2. Now I have 13 pi over 8. And I have 14 pi over 8. That's 7 pi over 4. Now I have 15 pi over 8. And last but not least, 16 pi over 8, which is 2 pi. Okay, if that's too confusing to reduce, just leave them unreduced. Just 1 pi over 8, 2 pi over 8, 3 pi over 8, 4 pi over 8, that's fine. Okay, so now my axes are set up. Now I just need to do my main sine dots. Okay, so sine starts at 0. So there's my first dot. Then sine goes up to the highest, which is 1, back to we call it the midline, back to 0, down to the lowest, which is -1, and back to the midline. Now, usually I connect at the very end, but let's talk about this. This right now that I have is 1 cycle of sine, and that makes sense because the period is pi over 2. 1 cycle should end at pi over 2, and it does. Okay, let's continue on. So I did the middle. Now I do the top, middle, bottom, middle, top, middle, bottom, middle, top, middle, bottom, middle. Connect. Okay. All right. Sorry, it's not perfectly connected, but that's okay. Okay, so I see 1, 2, 3, 4 cycles from 0 to 2 pi, which is what I expect to see since the frequency is 4. Okay, let's do a cosine one. Let's talk, even before we start, let's talk about what a cycle of cosine looks like. The cycle of cosine looks different than a cycle of sine. So a cycle of cosine starts at the highest, whatever the highest y is, then goes down to the midline, then goes down to the lowest, then back to the midline, then back to the highest. So cosine also has 5 main dots, like sine does. Cosine can also be broken down into 4 sections, like sine. Okay. So when we find those critical intervals, it's still going to be that same formula, period over 4. Okay, we graph a little different. Instead of starting at 0, we start at the highest. So we go highest, then middle, then lowest, then middle, then highest. Okay, so let's do this one together. Do a cosine together. So the amplitude, 1/2. So it's only going to go up to 1/2. The range is going to be -1/2 to 1/2. Okay, the frequency is 3. That means I'm going to see 3 cycles from 0 to 2 pi. The period, well, that's 2 pi over 3. Okay, so now what we need to do is we need to figure out the critical values. So the critical values is the period divided by 4. Well, what that means is it's 2 pi over 3 divided by 4. Okay, that's a pretty tricky one to figure out. So what you can do is you can do in your calculator 2/3 divided by 4. So you don't put the pi in. So really we're just trying to figure out what 2/3 divided by 4 is. So 2/3 divided by 4 is 1/6. So I'm going to have a critical interval at every 1/6 pi, or every pi over 6. Okay, so let's write them down. So our critical values is going to be 0, then 1 pi over 6, then 2 pi over 6, then 3 pi over 6, 4 pi over 6, 5 pi over 6, 6 pi over 6. That's pi. And we're going up to 2 pi. Again, it just happens to be that that's what I asked you to graph from, 0 to 2 pi. You won't always graph from 0 to 2 pi. So after 6 pi over 6 is 7 pi over 6, 8 pi over 6, 9 pi over 6, 10 pi over 6, 11 pi over 6, and 12 pi over 6. And I'm going to stop at 12 pi over 6 because 12 pi over 6 is 2 pi. Okay. So let's set up our axes now that we have our critical values. All right, so my alrighty. So I only need to go up to a half. So I don't know. You could kind of set up your scale however you want. Maybe I'll do 4 boxes for 1. That way I can actually do 2 boxes for a half. And that would be negative a half, and that would be a half. Okay. All right. So we have 0. Okay, then we have pi over 6. Then 2 pi over 6. I'm actually not going to reduce them this time. Just so you could see that that's okay. 3 pi over 6, 4 pi over 6, 5 pi over 6, 6 pi over 6, 7 pi over 6, 8 pi over 6, 9 pi over 6, 10 pi over 6, 11 pi over 6, 12 pi over 6. Now, sometimes you can skip boxes and spread it out. I wasn't sure if I would make it, so I didn't do that for this one. Okay, so now let's graph our cosine. Okay, so cosine starts at the highest. So in this case, that's a half. So that's going to go here. Then at the next critical value, it goes down to the midline. Then at the next critical value, down to the lowest, midline, highest. So again, normally I would do the whole thing, but I just want to talk about, we stopped at 4 pi over 6. 4 pi over 6 is the same as 2 pi over 3, which is the period. So the period, 2 pi over 3, is where the first cycle should end, and it does. At 2 pi over 3, which is 4 pi over 6, my first cycle ends. Okay, so let's keep going. So we were at the highest. Now I'm going to go to the middle. Now I'm going to go to the lowest, middle, highest, middle, lowest, middle, highest. And let's connect. And I'm really done, but let's just see that I graphed from 0 to 2 pi. My frequency was 3. That means I should see 3 full cycles from 0 to 2 pi. So there's 1 cycle in orange, there's 2 in yellow, and here's the 3rd in green. 3 full cycles. Okay. I would like you to try number 3 on your own. I do want to say one thing though. negative in front of the sine or negative in front of the cosine is a reflection over the x-axis. So a negative sine still starts at the midline, but then since it's negative, it's going to go down first instead of up. Then midline, then highest, then midline. So that's what a negative sine is going to look like when you do that one. So do number 3 and submit that for your homework for today. Okay, bye.